Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are back with another discussion, not so much an innovator interview, but an analysis of what's going on with Chevron. We're talking today with Professor Daniel Lin. He's the Associate Professor of Operations Management at the University of San Diego's School of Business. And he's advising several nonprofits, including Earthworks, Global Witness, and Greenpeace USA, that have filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission against Chevron for deceptive greenwashing advertising that, quote, overstates investments in renewable energy and the company's commitment to reducing fossil fuel production. Now, according to the complaint, which you can read at earthworks.org, and we'll have a link in the introduction to the podcast so you can check that out. According to the complaint, Chevron is the second most polluting company in the world and has contributed more than 43.35 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in greenhouse gases to the atmosphere since 1965. They currently have no plan to reduce its overall emissions. Between 2010 and 2018, Chevron spent only 0.2%, that's 2/1000ths of percent, of its capital expenditures, only $26 million out of $13 billion a year on lowering their carbon footprint. Now, take a look at the complaint. It's the first to call on the Federal Trade Commission to apply what they call the Green Guide Principles, which they established in 1992, to end environmental greenwashing claims by Chevron or any company. This is literally the first time. Daniel, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Good morning, Mitch.
Well, let me ask you, how did you get involved in this complaint? There are three major nonprofits involved, but how did you get connected?
Well, for full disclosure, I do not work with them directly, but my research area has been in sustainability in supply chain overall. So This kind of issue has always been in my attention, especially in this complaint. The keyword here is greenwashing. Just to the audience, greenwashing refers to a company when a company misleadingly label a practice or product as environmentally friendly or sustainable, but without following it through or simply make a false claim about that. So that's called greenwashing. And I have been working on sustainability region with different certificates, this arena. And this is just the newest episode of similar greenwashing I have been noticed. It's just a bigger one. It's Chevron. It's a well-known company, but greenwashing is not a new phenomenon, unfortunately. There has been many examples.
So let me ask this question. Chevron spends a ton of money on advertising, about $100 million a year. Do they spend more money talking about being green than actually being green?
I'm not sure if they disclose that, but based on what we know, only 0.2% of their capital expenditure is really doing something. It's a reasonable question to ask. Do they really maybe they do spend more money on advertising than really doing something?
Well, they have their tagline is Chevron is the human energy company, and I checked out their site after reading this, and the first page makes a variety of environmental claims, including a headline that says, "The future of energy is low carbon. It's only human." So can you explain how much of Chevron revenue comes from renewable energy today? Do we have any sense of whether they even make money on low carbon?
Very little. All they say is, well, we partner with whatever company to make our operation more sustainable, lower carbon emission. We invest in startups, we invest in companies to make this world better. But these are all kind of circumstantial. These are not fundamental changes in the business model. The business model is still fossil fuel. When it comes to fossil fuel, I mean, the process of converting fossil fuel into the gas or product, that process is not going to be changed no matter what kind of energy you use. No matter how you improve the process is still the process. So there's really not much they can do. They can say, well, instead of using fossil fuel to power our facility, now we're using renewable energy to power our facility. But you know what? We still need to generate the emission we need to generate. Well, unless we convert all of our operation into renewable energy. Otherwise, well, this is a very capital intensive process, very expensive process.
Mhm.
We probably still need to, in my opinion, they still need to, at least in the foreseeable future, they still need to rely a lot on fossil fuel to power their operation.
So as long as they're using fossil fuels or making fossil fuel-based products, they're contributing to this at the same level that they used to. And as we use more energy and so forth, we're only contributing more by using more of their product, is what you're saying.
Roughly, yes, but we need to be very careful about making that claim because they will disagree with that. They will say, well, but they're trying to reduce their so-called emission intensity.
Right.
That is their goal. They're trying to reduce it from by 5 to 10% in the next couple of years. But here's what is confusing people. Emission intensity. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't. Well, that sounds good, but as a matter of fact, they define it as an emission rate. That's not the emission produced. It's a rate of
a ratio of CO2 emitted to the product produced.
Exactly. Well, it's the amount of CO2 emitted per unit of energy produced. Okay. So it's like telling you, you know what? I buy a vehicle that this car is very environment friendly. It produces much less CO2 compared to my old car.
Mm-hmm.
But the company didn't tell you, oh, by the way, we're going to sell 100 times more of this kind of cars. So, well, in the end, as a result, actually, we can probably produce more greenhouse gas. That's the trick.
So on March 10th, about 6 days before this complaint was filed, Chevron announced what they called the Climate Change Resilience Program. What did they commit to do to become resilient? And does being resilient do anything to reduce their emissions?
I need to go back to look at that. Basically, what they claim to do is, as I mentioned, they focus a lot on emission intensity. Mm-hmm. And they even build that into the compensation of their top leaders. So they spend a lot of energy on that, but they do not talk anything about zero emission target. In mm-hmm. other words, they do not commit to the total emission we're going to generate it. But
as a company,
as a company. And it is almost, in my opinion, impossible for them to make that claim. If they claim that, mm-hmm. then that means they're putting themselves a cap on the amount of fossil fuel they can produce. And there are two things that are going on. First, the gas price is, at least in the short period of amount of time, it's going down. In the foreseeable future, the gas price is going down. And if you look at their production, their total production is going up. Well, that makes sense because the price is going down. So the only way for the company to maintain their profitability is to produce more.
Right.
And how can you, as a company, how can we put ourselves in such a constraint? By saying we are not going to produce more than whatever amount. So, and simple math.
So that's really clear. And the fact is that as modern prosperity becomes more widely available around the planet, more people are using more of the fuel that powered the old economy. And Chevron's making no investment to become a creator of renewable fuels. They're simply trying to reduce the emissions associated with processing petroleum into gasoline. Now, let me ask about the Federal Trade Commission. Why does somebody have to file a complaint before they can act? Can the FTC take action of this kind without being requested by the public?
Well, this is all. This is entirely the jurisdiction of FTC because there is no regulation. What FTC announced back in 1992 is a guideline.
Right.
The guideline. So it's not a law. So there is flexibility for FTC to determine what's the next step. And that is the ambiguity part of this whole episode as well. It's not entirely clear when is the next step and what will be the next step. So basically FTC and Chevron both declined to comment on this case. So it's
really
it's not as far, well, at least not to media inquiries as far as I know. So I cannot really find any response from FTC or Chevron on this matter. Okay, so it's ambiguous.
So if we want the FTC to take action, citizens have to get together and demand it, is what you're saying.
That's in my opinion. Yes, we need to voice up to give pressure to FTC. And as you know, Chevron, as everyone knows, Chevron is a major corporate, and it's very likely they have they're lobbying for their interests, just like every company probably would do. So it's really, in my opinion, fall into our hand to kind of to take actions to make this progress forward. The good sign is, well, FTC has made similar penalty to other companies in other industry for this kind of greenwashing behavior, greenwashing actions. Mm-hmm. This is just the first time this is happening to a fossil fuel company and to a company of this size.
Do you see the Biden administration potentially giving the FTC more teeth to act with?
So far, we haven't seen any clear evidence, but we have seen from the Biden administration many signs that they, compared to the previous administration, this is an administration that is more friendly and more supportive of sustainability. So I'm optimistic to that. However, as we know, there is a lot of things on their plate, and I'm not sure if this case would surface to the level of attention by the administration. So coming back, so I think this is a case where we, general public, need to voice up through the channels that are at our disposal to give more pressure.
Now, one of the, in fact, the day that we are speaking, and this is a pre-recorded call, everybody, the organization Stop the Money Pipeline, it's a coalition of 160 environmental groups, came out and essentially pointed out that the four largest banks in the United States are also the four largest financiers of petroleum exploration. They've financed $976 billion in drilling since 2016. Can the administration put regulations in place to prevent or at least make these banks accountable for the contribution they're making to future climate damage?
In my opinion, there might be some major challenge in doing that, mm-hmm. because unless there's some hard evidence that Chevron is doing something either illegally or doing something that is really harmful for the environment. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, basically, I think it's very difficult for any administration to point to some investors and basically say, hey, you know what, we don't like that company, so right. You cannot invest on them. It's probably relatively difficult to utilize regulation in that format. So basically, what you're alluding to is, is there anything from the regulation side that mm-hmm. the government can do something to stop this? Mm-hmm. Well, I'm a business professor, so I see things from business perspective. The way I see for anyone to incentivize a company or a person to do something, there are two ways. I call it carrot and stick, okay. Right? Put it simple. So regulation is really like stick, mm-hmm. in my opinion. Okay, you cannot do this, you cannot do that. Otherwise, I penalize you. The other option is carrot, incentive for companies to do something. And the biggest, so what I do is I look into where do they sell their product, like what is driving their business. So if you look at the petroleum product overall, 66% of the petroleum product is consumed by one sector, and it's probably not surprising. It's a transportation.
Sure.
Okay, so let's look at the transportation. What kind of energy do this sector consume the most? Well, not surprising. Close to 90% of the energy from that sector is from petroleum products, fossil fuel in general. Okay, and if you break down the transportation industry and look at the mode of transportation, you'll find that, well, probably not too surprising again, at least in the US, close to 60% of the transportation energy is consumed in passenger vehicles. Okay, so what does that tell us? That tells us consumers actually are very powerful in this sector. We, general consumer passengers, represent the biggest sector or market for the fossil fuel companies. And what is happening right now? Well, happening right now is we're changing our consumption from fossil fuel, from combustion vehicle into electric vehicle. So that represents a biggest challenge for companies like Chevron, because that represents a potential drop. If our economy is changed to electric vehicle, that's a roughly 30 to 40% decline in the consumption of their product.
Right.
And the good news is we have a few states, Washington, California, and Massachusetts, as far as I know, are making laws planning to ban the sales of new fossil fuel vehicles by anywhere between 2030 and 2035.
Right.
So if other states can follow up, if the consumers can make a push for this electric vehicle move, that can probably make more pressure, realistic pressure from the demand side. And in my opinion, that will be a more effective way to drive business decision.
So let me ask this. In the interim, before we turn away from petroleum as the fuel source for most of our private transportation, could we use a price on carbon to create incentives to shift spending towards electric, particularly renewably generated electric?
Yes, that's in the interim. I'm a supporter of carbon tax. I believe that can mitigate. It does not resolve the issue, but it can potentially mitigate. But you also have some challenges, as we know. First, how do you measure that? Well, mostly it's reported by companies. You self-report your carbon emission. You measure in some way and you report it. And it's very hard to audit, as you can imagine. And ideally, we should automate this process so there is no human interference. We should involve IoT devices to capture that, but it is not that easy, and it also involves additional investment. And this is not something that will bring company additional revenue. So there's not much incentive for companies to invest on that. So
and so that kind of measurement is only applicable or useful when you have a regulation that enforces reporting the measurement.
Exactly, unless there's regulation says, hey, you know what, you just need to do it anyway.
Yeah. Now, in its latest quarterly report, Chevron says it took action to advance a lower carbon future by announcing plans with partners. So they've already moved 2 degrees away from Chevron doing something to develop carbon negative bioenergy and commercially viable large scale businesses in hydrogen. Are they really doing that?
Well, by investing on new companies, it serves 2 purposes for the company, for Chevron. First, of course, addressing that environmental issue. Secondly, helping them to identify new revenue source other than fossil fuel. So in that regard, I do believe they are really trying to invest on that and potentially, hopefully, growing into another business model. They're so entrenched in this fossil fuel business model. It's very capital intensive. So once you invest, you want to get most out of it. Renewable energy is great, but the whole sector is still relatively small and not as profitable. So it's in my opinion, I do believe they invest in those companies or those opportunities really primarily for new business opportunity. But of course, the side product is better environment impact. Yeah.
But would you expect them to invest more if they were serious about it? I guess because $26 million.
Yeah.
How does that compare to companies that you see as taking genuinely meaningful steps?
It's all be challenging, to be honest. It's in my opinion, it's quite challenging because it's highly uncertain, and even if it works, the new business model is not likely to be comparable to its current operation in near future. Well, that's one. Second, although the consumption of petroleum product can be declining in the States, which in the United States, which I agree is the biggest consumption in the world, but other part of the world is picking up their consumption of petroleum product at the same time. So again, coming back to the demand, everything driven by demand. There is not a significant sign of decline in petroleum product overall in foreseeable future. I see it as the biggest hurdle to reduce their fossil fuel operation. It is really kind of like the comeback with drug cartel. I mean, I'm not saying Chevron is not like drug cartel, but how the business works like that. We can take out drug kingpin one after the other. But what really happened is once you take out one drug kingpin, there will be a new one. And the reason is simple, because there's always demand. As long as there is demand, then someone is going to supply. So regulation is a penalty to control, curtail, but not to eliminate the environmental impact. It all, in my opinion, it all needs to come down to demand.
So when you look at this as a business professor, this supply chain, Chevron supply chain, compared to other supply chains in industries that are undergoing rapid transformation, this is a capital-intensive undertaking, and they have spent, as far as we know, $26 million a year, which is roughly enough to finance half of a startup that has a capital-intensive infrastructure. How much should they be allocating on an annual basis if you were giving them advice about how to win in renewable energy? How much should they be investing, do you think?
Well, it comes down to how much profit they're making. If you look at the gas price, let's say on average $3.8. If you break down that price, retail price, and look at where the money goes, how the costs are allocated, a majority chunk really goes to roughly like 2/3 of the retail price goes to refinery and basically the extraction of fossil fuels. So basically that's the cost goes to Chevron. Distribution, marketing, retailing, those are a tiny fraction of the cost. So what I'm trying to say is the profit margin, after all, is not that high. And the operation is very expensive and capital intensive. So what happens to companies like that? Well, we simply need to make more product to make up for the profit. Mm-hmm. So when the margin is relatively thin compared to some other industries, I don't think they have too much leeway to invest on other renewable energy. If you ask me for a number, I may say, well, they need to invest more aggressively, at least probably 10 times what they're doing right now.
And you would consider that a minimum?
I would say that's a minimum. And the biggest challenge is really on the change of mindset within the company. Chevron is likely a victim of its own success. We have been doing so well in the fossil fuel sector, and if anyone raised the proposal that, hey, you know what, let's invest more on something new, but it's highly uncertain, we don't know what will happen, there is definitely a lot of opposition saying, why don't we invest in fossil fuel and let's try to make it clean? Because we already have big win on that. Okay, that would be the battle within Chevron or any company like that. Instead, if you look at other companies, for example, Solar City on the solar sector, it's a new company and there's only one business model to bet on. Then that gives them the drive to make it work. Chevron probably would not have the luxury for that matter. So a better approach potentially, well, to be honest, is what they are doing. Invest on new startups, a separate company to bet on the other new ventures.
And then acquire that company.
Or yes. Exactly.
You can project from their success how much Chevron can make in the future. So it sounds like what you're saying is they are trapped by their current business model.
Yes, that's in my opinion.
And they would need to actually be honest with their investors and say, look, we have to take some risks if they wanted to increase their spending.
Exactly. And that's a dilemma faced by top managers of basically every company. When I believe they understand fossil fuel, there's concern about fossil fuel. We need to diversify our portfolio. But the downside of doing that is the potential downturn of our profitability. And that's a fear of every CEO. So that's a concern.
There was one other element, because we have talked a lot about carbon capture on this show. The complaint criticizes Chevron for, quote, doubling down on carbon capture technology, unquote. So what is the issue with carbon capture technology? That it's unproven, that it's not economically viable today, that it uses more energy, or that it gives people an excuse because you can capture carbon to put more carbon in the atmosphere? Why is that a problem?
It's definitely all the above, but relatively speaking, the major concerns will be first, is the technology mature? The problem is not. We've seen news here and there. This company, this university, piloted a project on whatever technology for carbon capture. That's great. That's a first step. But having a prototype to mass production, there's a huge gap in between. There is a huge gap, but there are companies like Climeworks, Heirloom that just announced recently, Blue Planet, that are doing work. Granted, it's not at scale, but it's scaling up. Yes.
So here's the question I wanted to ask: if carbon capture could work, and at that point, should oil companies be required to retire, not just offset, but retire their emissions every year based on carbon capture technology? Would that be a step in the right direction?
If the technology has been proven to be mature and cost effective, then I believe it's a time for a regulator to look at that to replace or in lieu of carbon tax, in my opinion, because it's more essential. However, the tricky part here is I use the word cost effective. So what does that mean by cost effective? Well, every person, every company has different perspective on that. So that, in my opinion, will be another point of argument going forward. But generally speaking, I do support the direction that when the carbon capture is mature, is affordable, that is something that regulator should consider. However, that will lead to the concern that you raised too. Hey, does that mean we can consume more because we can capture it? So in my opinion, it's still a kind of intermediary approach. In the meanwhile, before we jump into renewable energy, this is a good intermediary step to kind of patch the problem we're looking at right now. In the end, it's still driven by demand.
So what is the next step in the FTC complaint process? What happens next?
What happens next, as far as I know, is probably waiting for any hearing, and FTC probably will announce what they are trying to do next to the public, and then I think the ball is with FTC at this point to announce what's the next step.
How can our listeners get involved? Can they write to the FTC? Can they, demand that this happen? And where should they do that?
I will encourage, if anyone is interested in this action, contact FTC directly or reflect that call to the president's office directly to raise any attention on that. That's the short-term things that we can do. But overall, for the long term, I still believe that we need to shift to renewable energy. That will be the long-term cure for the challenge that we're.
So for the time being, let's stop being Chevron customers.
That's why we do
shifting to EVs, and then if Chevron wants to survive, they'll start making renewable energy.
Yes, that's all I will say. Yeah, if you have a other gas station around you, you have Shell or you have whatever mobile, maybe you can consider other options.
Okay. Well, Daniel, I want to thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Mitch. It's a pleasure talking with you.
Well, please come back and keep us up on what's going on with this complaint.
Yeah, I'm paying attention to this case too. I'm very curious to learn what is going to happen. As we know, this is the first similar greenwashing complaint to a fossil fuel company. So this is a very important case that may set a stone for the future cases.
Well, we'll keep an eye on it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, folks, that was Professor Daniel Lin. He's Associate Professor of Operations Management at the University of San Diego School of Business. And of course, he is advising the Earthworks, Global Witness, and Greenpeace USA organizations in their Federal Trade Commission complaint against Chevron. We'll include a link so you can read more about it in the article that accompanies this podcast, but we urge you to reach out both to the Federal Trade Commission and to the Office of the President. You can call these folks or you can write letters on their website. Demand that this action be taken seriously. It's something that we can use to start to change the economy. This is Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we will be back with another interview soon. In the meantime, let's take care of one another, let's take care of ourselves, and all of us take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.